Our scripture today comes from the 12th chapter of Romans, verses 9 through 21. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink, for by doing this you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I think now it's social media, but when I was growing up, if you wanted to distill a certain philosophy of life or a certain world view down to 3 or 4 words, you put it on a t-shirt or a bumper sticker. I think now we just simply put it online. But I know there were several that I learned growing up that centered on that idea of revenge. Don't get mad, get even. Then, of course, there was that famous line, revenge is a dish best served cold. Lines or a version of that line occurs both in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, or if you're more a classic kind of movie person, it's also in The Godfather. But it actually goes back way before that. It first appears in a mid-1800s French novel. There's another one I've seen that probably would have made a t-shirt or a bumper sticker had I encountered it in my childhood, but now I simply see it on Facebook. It says, "Don't go to bed mad. Stay up and plot your revenge." I think we as human beings have something just ingrained in us to want to seek vengeance. Revenge is that dish served cold. It goes back a couple hundred years almost now. It's clear those early followers of Jesus in Rome must have been wrestling with that issue as well. If they wouldn't have been, Paul wouldn't have included it in his writings. It's quite simple. Paul's letter, what we now know as the book of Romans, he was writing to a group of Christians in Rome, and it was written towards the end of his ministry. A lot of scholars think it's probably one of his most well thought out, one of his most mature writings on Christianity. He spends the first 11 chapters of that letter or that book laying out his argument for why the salvation that is offered to us through the death and resurrection of Jesus is offered to everyone, both Jew and Gentile. The chapter 12 then wraps it up. It is the therefore, literally the first sentence of chapter 12 is therefore. And from there, Paul goes on. He spells out 23 different things followers of Christ need to do as they live together as a community of faith. So if we look to that section of Romans as a guide for how to live and how to live together in community, I think some of those 23 things are things that we're called to do and don't necessarily seem particularly difficult. Rejoice in hope. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. None of that, at least to me, seems like it would be particularly challenging for those of us following Jesus today. There are some that get a little more difficult. I think the idea of extending hospitality to strangers is one that often pushes us out of our comfort zone. But then there's that one that I think just runs against human nature. Never avenge yourselves. And then it goes to so far as if your enemies are hungry, give them food. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. That's just not, I think, how human beings are programmed. That's not what we want to do. We don't want to get mad. We want to get even. But Paul tells us that's not who we're called to be if we're followers of Jesus. Now later, not too much later, Christians in Rome face persecution at the hands of Emperor Nero. And those stories are gruesome. But this letter is written before that occurs. So he's not writing to followers of Jesus who are under siege by the government of Rome. He's addressing really more day-to-day lives and those conflicts that arise between neighbors, families, friends, situations that merely may be more like you and I. Newly converted Christians in Rome would suddenly find themselves on the outside of their old social circles, even of their families, when they became followers of Jesus. Friends and family may not approve of this idea that they were converting to Christianity. And then new Christians in Rome would find themselves refusing invitations to what were popular social events because those events would include what they now considered to be idol worship. And they didn't want to be a part of that any longer. It might not be as dramatic for us today, but there are times in our lives we as followers of Christ might find ourselves set apart from the rest of the world. Even within our own families, we might be in the minority of our family groups who make worship even a regular part of our lives. You're here today, but you may have close members of your family that are taking Sunday morning to have an extra cup of coffee and a nice brunch and catch up on their reading, or maybe they're out on the lake fishing, or they find something else to do on Sunday morning. And maybe that creates conflict because they would rather be together. We're also now living in a society that I believe has become more divided, more polarized than I think any of us probably remember. And there's a lot of issues, I think, going on that lead us to that. For one, we continue to see the struggle to end systemic racism in America. And that's led to emotional and violent confrontation. We see political polarization driven, I think, in part by the modern media landscape as that has decentralized and specialized, and modern social media, how it can target specific groups with specific messaging. It's driven also, I think, by the fact that we tend to gather less in groups and have conversations together, whether it is social clubs like the Elks or the American Legion. Those numbers have dwindled. Bowling leagues are now much smaller than they used to be. And that was even before we've encountered what we now encounter in this socially distanced pandemic world we live in. Over these next couple months, I think we're going to witness a presidential election campaign that is going to be intentional in its work of dividing us. I've done some reading last few days as I've recapping the last 2 weeks of political conventions. I'm just enough of a political junkie to follow that sort of thing, and sort of wanted some perspective on what had happened in the last 2 weeks and what we saw, sort of that bigger picture. I found one really interesting piece online on slate.com. The article points out generally a presidential nominee's acceptance speech is one which is positive, it's forward-looking. They're laying out a vision for a campaign, an administration, and for the country. It's that moment where they have the national spotlight and can make their best case for themselves. What they usually don't want to do is talk about their opponent. They don't even usually want to mention them. They want to focus on them and what they want to do. The current record prior to 2020 for mentioning your opponent's name in an acceptance speech was held by George H.W. Bush in 1992. He mentioned Bill Clinton 8 times. Thursday night, President Trump mentioned Vice President Biden 41 times. Definitely a different kind of acceptance speech. It's usually not about criticizing one's opponent. And while all that was taking place, we saw the deadly violence going on in Wisconsin. The 17-year-old who's now charged with killing 2 people, which is tied to protests which started as police shot an African-American man as part of a police call there. All of this, all of the discrimination, all of this division, for me, the foundation of it all lies when we fail to see each other as fully human. When we can look at someone else and not see a child of God. It's when we dehumanize people with whom we disagree that we can start to treat them as something less than or something less than human. You'll hear it in hate speech today. You'll hear it in that hateful language that's used, and we've seen that throughout history. In the run-up to World War II, the Nazi Party in Germany would compare Jews to rats in an attempt to make them appear less than fully human. The question then arises, then how do we, as 21st century followers of Jesus, here in middle America, in this middle-sized capital city, how do we respond in this world that's polarized, divided, hostile? And how do we do it in a way that lives into that therefore Paul writes in the 12th chapter of Romans? I think the first thing we have to do is we have to do something. If there's one thing I take away from reading Romans 12, it's that so much of that is a call to action. I think it's a call to engage with people. We're called to rejoice when others rejoice and weep when others weep. That means we're investing emotionally in the lives of the people around us. We can't just sit on the sidelines. Of course, rejoicing is a lot more fun than weeping. But then there's that hard stuff, right? Not repaying evil with evil. I think it is hard, and I think it even seems harder because now it happens, I think, less often than it used to. But you know, it wasn't that long ago. You'd see a very different world, and you could even see it on that national political stage. As I watched all of this over the last couple of weeks, I went back to one of those moments you remember. And this one was from the 2008 presidential campaign. Supporters of John McCain were at one of his rallies. They were voicing concerns about Barack Obama. Not policy concerns, not political concerns. They were concerned about his policies. They were concerned about him. They were scared of him. One woman started to speak and she said, I can't trust him. McCain cut this conversation short and surprised his supporters. As you watch the video, you can hear audible reaction that they're surprised when he starts to say this. But this is what Senator McCain said of his opponent. He said, he's a decent family man, a citizen I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues. That's what this campaign is about. He's a decent person and a person that you do not have to be scared of as a president. If I didn't think I'd be one heck of a better president, now I wouldn't be running. That's the point. But I admire Senator Obama and his accomplishments. I will respect him. I want everyone to be respectful, and let's make sure we are, because that's the way politics should be conducted in America. I don't know how you feel, but I'll tell you, I watched that, and man, 2008 felt like a lifetime ago. Now, I know none of you probably put your name on the ballot for President of the United States. I'm correct there, right? Nobody's running? Okay. But there's still things you can do without doing that. We can be respectful. As we have conversations with friends and family and our neighbors and people around us, we can make sure that those conversations are based in information that comes from trustworthy sources, that we're sharing things that are accurate. There's going to be lots of information out there that isn't. We don't need to resort to name calling. And we need to remember that political opponents aren't enemies. Now, you may only change one conversation or a couple conversations in your life, but if each of us change a couple, and somebody sees how you're acting, and maybe they realize they can do that too, it starts to spread. And then we continue to move towards that community where we're living, as Paul wrote, where we love one another with mutual affection, where we outdo one another in showing honor. See, the thing is, friends, I think we can do that, and we can disagree while we do that. But I still think one of the hardest things we're called to do is to not seek revenge, to overcome evil with good. It just goes against something deep within us. At least in the moment, revenge feels good. I'm sure in some point in your life you have probably gotten your revenge on someone for something, and you walked away and felt good. It's been about 30 years ago now. I became a fan of Tom Clancy and his novels. I'm sure at least a few of you remember those. The first one, of course, was Hunt for Red October, which got made into that big motion picture, that story of the Russian submarine commander who defects with his ship. And then the tension as both the American Navy and the Soviet Navy try to find him in the Atlantic Ocean. The second book was Patriot Games. In that, our hero, the CIA analyst Jack Ryan, who was helping the U.S. Navy track the sub, inadvertently finds himself drug into a conflict between Britain and Irish terrorists. They attack his wife and daughter. His daughter is shot and almost killed. And at the end of the novel, Jack Ryan finds himself face to face with the head of the terrorists in this small boat off the coast of the Atlantic near his home. He could have easily killed the terrorist, chooses not to, because he wants to see him brought to justice in the American courts. Like Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games gets made into a movie. Jack Ryan suddenly becomes Harrison Ford, but that's okay. But Hollywood also decides that ending's not going to work. They want Ryan to win in the end. They want Ryan to seek his vengeance. So he gets his revenge, kills the terrorist at the end of the movie, and while most of the audience may have been thinking that was a good thing. Maybe people like me who'd read the book first was like, oh man, you just ruined that ending. But Hollywood knew that what we'd want is that ending. It's that challenge not to respond in kind when we're hurt. It's hard not to match violence with violence. But there are times we can do it. And sometimes when you do it creatively, man, it can really be amazing. It's been a few years ago now, but there is a town in Germany that was struggling. They had regular marches there by young neo-Nazis. They had become this site almost of pilgrimages for young German neo-Nazis. It was the town where Rudolf Hess, Hitler's second-in-command, had been buried after he passed away. He's since been exhumed and cremated, but this town is still a place where Nazis want to gather and march. Whether intentionally or not, they followed the words of Paul. They found a way to overcome evil with good. The town turned this neo-Nazi march into what one observer called the world's largest involuntary walkathon. A group which fights Nazism in Germany organized sponsors to donate money for every kilometer the marchers walked through town. So the farther they walked, the more money this group raised. And they laid out the route they were going to march like a walkathon, if you've been involved in one of those as a fundraiser. There were banners encouraging them to walk, thanking them for being there. There were tables along the route with water bottles and bananas. They wanted to make sure they stayed hydrated, had their nourishment up, feeding their hungry enemy and giving them something to drink. They'd painted signs on the pavement along the road telling them how much money would be raised as they passed intervals along the way. By the end of the march, they had raised about $12,000 to help fight Nazism in Germany. Raised because of a march by neo-Nazis. It's really a creative story, but it was how good overcame evil. I'm sure some of those marchers showed up that day hoping to have people protest, hoping to find some conflict, hoping to agitate. Instead, they were overrun with kindness and love and probably didn't quite know what to make of that. And we may never pull off something like that. But over the next couple months, political news will take up more and more of our time and energy just because it is October and September in the fall of a year that's divisible by 4 in America. Then how we respond to each other will matter. If we respond as followers of Jesus, I think that means we treat one another with respect. I think that means we don't seek vengeance if we feel like someone has treated us badly. We don't repay evil with evil. We don't resort to that name calling. I think then our conversations become a little different. And then election day comes and goes, and we head into that holiday season. And sometimes those conversations can become tense as well. Family members don't always get along. They don't always disagree. And I don't know if we'll have Thanksgiving dinner in person or if we'll all gather and carve a virtual turkey on Zoom this year. But there again, if we have conversations where we rejoice and weep together, if we have conversations where we are respecting one another, there may be less conflict and more love at a Thanksgiving table or two. I think anytime we see someone else as a child of God, at a point when before we may have seen them as something less. Or when we can now hold accountable systems that treat others as less than fully human. That's when we are doing the work of bringing about God's kingdom here on earth. And for that, friends, I think we give thanks to God.